Chapter 1. "Hey, Dr. Thompson, is that a monkey?" Dr. Margaret Anderson asked, looking skeptically at the small, brown animal on Dr. Robert Thompson's shoulder. "Yeah, it's Boo," Dr. Thompson replied, tutting and tugging at his unruly hair. He held Boo out towards Dr. Anderson, who cautiously extended a hand for the little monkey to sniff. Boo hopped onto her palm and nimbly wrapped his arm around her wrist. Dr. Anderson chuckled, surprised at the creature's agility. "He's a smart one, isn't he?" she commented as Boo spun around in circles, his mischievous eyes never straying from hers. "Yes, he's quite extraordinary," Dr. Thompson replied, his voice far away and distant. He stared blankly towards the rows of lab tables and high-tech equipment, his mind already drifting into the depths of his research. She studied him for a moment, wondering what was troubling him. Dr. Thompson had always been passionate about his work, but there seemed to be something different about him today. His usual enthusiasm was missing, replaced by a distant, vacant expression. "Boo, you're saying that Boo can mimic human speech and behavior?" she asked, entering the lab just as Boo hopped onto her hand. Boo imitated her tone perfectly, repeating her question as if in answer. Dr. Thompson chuckled, shaking his head in bemusement. "Yes, and it's getting more and more accurate by the day. It's like he's trying to become just like me." Dr. Thompson laughed nervously, fidgeting with the lab papers on the table. Dr. Anderson raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the peculiar behavior of Boo. She had never heard of a monkey mimicking its owner's behavior to such a degree. "You know, Bob, this is fascinating work you're doing here, but don't let it consume you. It's important to maintain a balance between work and personal life," she said, resting a gentle hand on his arm. "You're a brilliant researcher, but you can't neglect your own well-being and relationships." He blinked in surprise, pulled out of his thoughts by her caring concern. "I know you're right, Margaret, but it's hard for me to imagine stopping when I'm so close to solving this mystery. Boo's abilities are unprecedented, and I can't afford to let anything distract me." She sighed softly, understanding his determination, but still worried for him. "Just promise me that you'll take some time for yourself, every once in a while." "You know I worry about you," Dr. Anderson said, leaning against the lab counter and watching as Dr. Thompson and Boo bonded together. Dr. Thompson hesitated, looking down at Boo, who had climbed up onto his shoulder once more. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair and sighed. "I know you do, Margaret, and I'll try to make more time for myself, but I can't deny that I'm fascinated by this creature. Boo's abilities are almost uncanny, and I can't help but feel compelled to understand why and how he does what he does. It's as if he's studying me, almost as much as I'm studying him." "Speaking of which," Dr. Thompson said, turning back to Dr. Anderson as Boo continued to cling to him like a little shadow, "have you noticed how Boo seems to be taking on some of my mannerisms and speech patterns?" Dr. Anderson furrowed her brow, considering for a moment. "Yes, I have noticed that. It's fascinating, really, how closely he mimics your every move, but it's not entirely abnormal for animals to learn the behaviors of their keepers," she said, gently. Thompson sighed. running his hands through his disheveled hair as he paced back and forth. "I wish it were that simple," he said grimly. "It's more than just behaviors, Margaret. Boo, he's trying to take on my identity. It's like he wants to become me in every way possible. He's trying to fool my colleagues, mimicking my every movement and word. But it's not just about being a carbon copy of me. It's more than that." Dr. Anderson crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow as she regarded her colleague and Boo. "What do you mean?" she asked, intrigued. "Boo is learning and internalizing my work habits, my thought process, and even my mannerisms. It's as if he's trying to take over my identity. I've seen him pretending to write notes, as if studying my research. It's getting harder and harder to tell the difference between us." Dr. Thompson said, his eyes wide with wonder and fear. That's certainly a unique situation," Dr. Anderson said, trying to process what she'd just heard. "I understand why you're concerned, but have you considered the possibility that Boo is just very intelligent and curious? Maybe he's just trying to learn and adapt to his environment," Dr. Anderson suggested, hoping to ease Dr. Thompson's concern. "No, it's more than that," Dr. Thompson insisted, shaking his head. "Just yesterday, I caught Boo looking at himself in a mirror, as if trying to see himself as I see him. He repeated my name and made the same gestures I often make when I see my reflection. It's as if he wants to become me." Dr. Anderson frowned, considering the strange phenomenon. Chapter 2. The once bright, welcoming loft felt like a paranoid nightmare to Dr. Thompson as he stumbled through the front door, bags of groceries spilling out from his arms. A chilling wind blew in from the open terrace as he slammed the door shut. Dr. Thompson trudged towards the kitchen, the weight of anxiety pulling at his shoulders. As he set the groceries on the counter, his eyes flicked towards Boo, who sat on the armrest of the nearby leather sofa, seemingly oblivious to his master's return. The little monkey's eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was almost human-like, making Dr. Thompson feel a shiver of unease. Struggling to shake off the sensation, he proceeded to put away the groceries as he began to hear faint noises coming from the direction of the bathroom. He paused, holding a can of cat food in his hand, listening intently. The sounds were faint and unrecognizable, but they sent a jolt of fear through Dr. Thompson. He quickly made his way towards the bathroom, his heart pounding in his chest. Swinging the door open, a shock ran through his veins as he saw the toilet seat up. An odd, small habit that he had, but one that he never expected his little mimic to pick up. "Boo?" Dr. Thompson questioned hesitantly, peering around the room. The toilet paper had been unrolled, just as he always did before using the bathroom, and even the sink faucet had been left running slightly. Dr. Thompson felt a cold sweat trickle down his back as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Dr. Thompson called out again, his voice quivering with fear. "What's going on?" No response came from the bathroom, only the sound of the running water. Dr. Thompson glanced at Boo, still perched on the leather sofa. The little monkey stared back at him with his bright, intelligent eyes. They held an unusual knowingness that left Dr. Thompson feeling both awestruck and uncomfortable. Shaking his head, Dr. Thompson retreated from the bathroom, taking the time to properly close the door and switch off the faucet. He decided to not let his paranoia get the better of him, attributing the strange happenings to a simple coincidence. As he returned to the kitchen, he could not ignore the niggling feeling in the back of his mind. How was it that Boo was so good at mimicking him? Almost as if he was studying him, trying to become the perfect version of Dr. Thompson. But instead of dwelling on his concerns, he opted to return to his research with the goal of understanding the complexities of Boo's intelligence. After all, there was no definitive proof yet that Boo had any malign intent, other than being a clever monkey. Days turned into weeks as he continued his investigation. Each day, as Dr. Thompson left for work, Boo seemed to become more and more adept at aping his movements and research. The lab technicians would often catch him using complicated lab equipment with astonishing accuracy, as if he had seen Robert do it countless times. It was as if Boo was constantly observing and absorbing every detail of Dr. Thompson's life. At first, Dr. Thompson found Boo's abilities fascinating, but soon they began to trouble him. He could feel himself slipping further and further into obsessive paranoia. Every creak of the apartment building seemed suspicious. Every shadow cast by the streetlights outside seemed ominous. Dr. Thompson was walked on eggshells, constantly on edge, never knowing what to expect. As he prepared dinner, he caught a glimpse of Boo mirroring his movements in the kitchen window reflection. He stopped mid-step and stared at Boo, a sense of unease creeping into his gut. Was Boo really just mimicking him? Or was he trying to take over his life in some way? Over the following days, Dr. Thompson became increasingly distraught as he observed Boo's behavior. It wasn't just the simple mimicry of his everyday actions, but something more sinister. Boo was becoming possessive, territorial, and showed signs of aggression towards Thompson when he was away from home. It wasn't long before Dr. Thompson would come home to find Boo sleeping in his bed, sunk into his easy chair, or draped over his precious research notes as though staking his claim on the apartment. The more time that passed, the more controlled and manipulative Boo became in his attempts to occupy Thompson's life. The monkey's transformation from jovial pet to cunning imposter was so gradual that it left Thompson questioning his own judgment and sanity. Was he simply being paranoid, or was his beloved primate truly morphing into his shadow? In a desperate bid to understand what he was experiencing, Thompson reached out to Dr. Margaret Anderson. As a colleague, she might offer a fresh perspective on Boo's behavior. The following evening, Dr. Thompson entered the lab with that very idea in mind. The weight of his recent observations on Boo's transformation haunted him still, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was overreacting to a perfectly normal phenomenon. He approached Dr. Anderson's office, which was lined with books on all sorts of primatology. Inside, she was hunched over her desk, examining diagrams and notes from one of her projects. She looked up as he entered, welcoming him with a smile. "Hey, Bob, come on in. I was wondering when you'd drop by," she said, setting her pen down. "You've seemed particularly occupied lately. Is there something on your mind?" And Dr. Thompson paused at the threshold, unsure of how to express himself. "Well, it's Boo, actually. I've made some unsettling discoveries about his behavior that I'd like your professional opinion on," he confessed, fidgeting with his hands. Rolling her chair around to face him, Dr. Anderson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Okay, I'm all ears. What's going on?" "It's like Boo is trying to take on my identity," Dr. Thompson whispered, his eyes round and wide. "He's been mimicking my every move, down to the smallest details. Even his voice has started to sound more like mine." "Mimicking your every move? That's incredibly unusual," Dr. Anderson said, furrowing her brow. Chapter 3. "I just can't shake this feeling, Margaret," Dr. Thompson whispered, leaning into the dimly lit confines of Dr. Anderson's office. The heavy yellow curtains swayed gently in the drafty breeze, casting an eerie glow across the laboratory. Dr. Anderson peered up from her notes, her eyes wide with concern. "Bob, I've told you before you need to take a break from this work. It's taking a toll on you." Her voice was soft but firm, and a hint of exasperation edged her words. The creases on her forehead deepened in concern as she studied her friend. He sighed, sinking into the chair opposite Dr. Anderson's desk. "You know I can't just brush it off, Margaret. Boo's behavior has become so erratic and intense that it's genuinely alarming me. I caught him not just mimicking my hand movements yesterday, but even repeating paragraphs from my latest paper verbatim in the same tone and cadence I use when speaking." "But Bob, that doesn't mean Boo has ill intent," she urged gently. "He's just a curious creature, and an incredibly smart one at that. It's only natural for him to mimic your every move. I mean, have you ever thought about the countless hours he spends observing you?" "I'm not mimicking a trained Dr. Thompson's arm, feeling the curious creature and an incredibly smart one at that. It's only natural for him to mimic your every move. I mean, have you ever thought about the countless hours he spends observing you?" He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on a distant corner of the room. "That's what scares me, Margaret. It's more than just imitation or mimicry. I've caught him exhibiting behaviors that are specific to my personality and habits. He's trying to become me, and I don't understand why or how." Dr. Anderson felt a pang of unease as she listened to her friend. She had never seen him so distressed, so alarmed. "Bob, I understand where you're coming from, but I think your fears might be rooted in your anxieties about your work. You've been working extremely hard for a long time now, and it's natural to feel overwhelmed. Boo's behavior might simply be a result of his close bond with you, his primary caregiver." Dr. Margaret Anderson placed a hand on Dr. Robert Thompson's shoulder, trying to comfort him and alleviate his fears. She truly hoped that her words would help her friend to not let stress and paranoia consume him. "Maybe you're right, Margaret," Dr. Thompson said, his voice filled with exhaustion. He turned to Dr. Anderson, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "But what if I'm not just attributing this to stress? What if there's something more sinister at play here? Boo is becoming more aggressive by the day, and I can't help but feel like he's trying to replace me. Bob, as your friend, I care about you, and I don't want you to obsess over this too much," Dr. Anderson replied, her voice full of concern. I understand that this is a strange and concerning situation, but I truly believe your interpretation might be influenced by stress and exhaustion. Animals tend to mimic behavior they observe from their caretakers, especially in instances where there's a strong bond. It's important to try and take a step back and consider other possibilities for Boo's behavior. Thompson nodded absent-mindedly, staring at the floor with furrowed brows. Anderson placed her hand on his shoulder and gave a reassuring squeeze. "Bob, we'll figure this out together, just like we always have. You're not alone in this," Dr. Anderson offered, her voice full of warmth and empathy. Dr. Thompson looked up and managed a weak smile, taking comfort from her words. "I know. I can always count on you, Margaret." They sat in silence for a while, contemplating the situation. Finally, Dr. Anderson broke the silence. "Bob, have you ever considered the possibility that Boo might be exhibiting this behavior because he is distressed or feeling lonely?" Dr. Thompson shook his head. "No, I don't think so. He's always been so lively and playful, but lately I've noticed that he's become more aggressive when I'm not around. It's like he's possessive of my things," Dr. Thompson said, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "I've tried to distance myself from my work and give him more attention, but it seems to only fuel this behavior." "What exactly have you noticed?" Dr. Anderson asked, her brows furrowed in concern. Dr. Thompson rubbed his tired eyes and took a deep breath. "Everything. I catch him sleeping in my bed at night, sitting in my chair when I'm not here, and even eating my food. It's like he's taking over my space." Dr. Anderson looked thoughtful for a moment before nodding slowly. "It does sound concerning, but let's not jump to conclusions. We have to see what happens once Dr. Galiof hears from you. It's possible that Boo is just seeking comfort and attachment to you. Perhaps the isolation and unstructured environment are causing stress, which in turn manifest as these territorial behaviors." "I suppose that's possible," Dr. Thompson responded, sounding hesitant. "But I've never seen him act like this before. I just can't understand why he suddenly behaves so erratically." Dr. Anderson placed a reassuring hand on Dr. Thompson's arm. "I understand how peculiar and worrying this all seems. But remember, we must approach this rationally and consider all possibilities." A silence stretched out between them as Dr. Thompson mused over her words. He knew she was right. He was letting his fears and insecurities cloud his judgment. Steeling himself, he took a deep breath and asked, "Okay, I get it. Let's take a step back and try to rule out other explanations for Boo's behavior." "Sounds like a plan," Dr. Anderson replied, her voice showing agreement. "Let's start by ruling out the most obvious explanations for Boo's behavior. We should consider factors related to his environment, physical health, and emotional well-being for potential changes that might have triggered his unusual behavior." "All right," Thompson agreed, relieved to focus on a systematic approach. "Firstly, I can't think of any recent changes in his physical environment. He still lives in the same habitat, with similar objects and the same care schedule. On most days, I monitor him to ensure there's no food or material deficiency." What about other animals or researchers interacting with him at the lab? Dr. Anderson inquired further. It's highly unlikely. Dr. Thompson shook his head. His habitat is at a safe distance from other primates, and I am the only one who routinely interacts with Boo. Besides, I've never noticed any abrupt changes in behavior based on such factors. That's interesting, she said, tapping her finger against her lips. Chapter 4. The sterile fluorescent glow of the nursing home cast eerie shadows across its stark white walls as Dr. Thompson hurried down the corridor. The air hummed with a combination of fear and trepidation. He had received a frantic phone call from a distraught monkey, had not only breached the primary security, but had also infiltrated the patients, impersonating an elderly resident as Dr. Thompson's elderly father. His heart hammered furiously against his ribcage as he remembered the subtle signs of Boo's manipulation. He shuddered at the thought of his once docile pet now infiltrating the sacred ground of his father's dignity in that sterile, lifeless facility. Please, limit my agitation, Dr. Thompson begged silently as he approached the nursing home's reception desk. The disinterested nurse, rolling her eyes, informed him that his father was already sedated and resting comfortably in his room. The nurse's indifferent attitude further fueled Dr. Thompson's panic. He brushed her off and swiftly made his way to his father's room, fearing the worst. Through the cracked open door, he spotted a figure curled up in the hospital bed, clad in his father's signature white undershirt and plaid pajama pants. The familiar face of Boo turned towards him, a look of cunning emanating from his sharp eyes. Dr. Thompson uttered in disbelief, "What have you done?" His words were met with silence. Boo was just sitting there, looking at him with his beady eyes. It was as if he was challenging him, daring him to make a move. Thompson took a deep breath and stared back at Boo, trying to understand what had driven his pet monkey to this bizarre act of mimicry. Surely it couldn't just be a desire for attention or affection. There was something more complex at play here. "Are you doing this, Boo?" Thompson asked softly, inching closer to the bed. He felt the instinctive pull to scold Boo for such wayward behavior, but held himself back, trying to keep calm. "This doesn't answer my question, Boo. What's going on?" Boo narrowed his eyes at Thompson, remaining silent. Then, to the astonishment of the primatologist, he slowly began to mimic the wobbly, soft speech pattern of his ailing father. Intonation, cadence, and slurred words. "Rab-rettered creepy," he said weakly. His frail voice barely held any resemblance to Dr. Thompson's strong, distinctive tone. The sight and sound were jarring, leaving Dr. Thompson in disbelief. "Dad?" he asked, his gaze softening. As he stood there, confronted with his elderly, helpless father and the cunning monkey impersonating him, he felt a surge of emotions overwhelming his senses: fear, confusion, and even a sense of retribution. "How did this happen?" he demanded, stepping closer to the bed and reaching out to touch his father's cold hand. But as he drew closer, he realized that the hand he was reaching for was not his father's. It was Boo's. The monkey had not only taken on his father's speech, but also his physical appearance. How could this be? Dr. Thompson murmured, recoiling from Boo in horror. The monkey continued to stare back at him, its eyes glinting with a disturbing intelligence. It was as if the line between animal and human was becoming increasingly blurred before his very eyes. "Boo, stop this. You need to understand that you are a monkey. An intelligent one, yes, but still a monkey," Dr. Thompson pleaded, taking a step back from the bed. The primatologist's gaze darted nervously between Boo and his father, who lay unconscious and seemingly oblivious to the bizarre charade being played in front of him. Boo continued to stare back at Dr. Thompson in silence, its eyes unblinking and its jaw clenched tight. Its mimicry was so unsettling that it sent a shiver creeping up Thompson's spine. Was it trying to convey something deeper? A subliminal message buried in the layers of its mischief? "I need you to understand. It's vital," Thompson begged, clutching at his scattered thoughts, torn between fascination and horror. As the unnerving moments ticked away, he contemplated the consequences of Boo's behavior. How would people react if they knew a monkey could not only mimic its caregiver's voice, but also impersonate him? Suddenly, the line between reality and illusion became increasingly hazy, their perceptions muddled by Boo's cunning. Thompson's thoughts swirled like a maelstrom as he tried to grapple with the terrifying implications of Boo's sinister act. The possibilities stretched before him, daunting and unnerving in equal measure. Boo, seemingly sensing Thompson's rising panic, edged closer to the bedside, its form now a doppelganger of his ailing father. The room fell into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of the nursing home machine. The rational part of Thompson's mind spun through plausible explanations for the monkey's display, but paranoia whispered insistently in his ears, drowning out reason. Could this be some kind of twisted attempt to usurp his identity? And if so, why now, after all these years spent bonding with the animal? A million questions crisscrossed Thompson's brain, but at the same time, the room was enveloped in an almost eerie hush as the primatologist and his doppelganger monkey stared one another down. Suddenly, Boo screeched, moving with an unnatural agility and speed that caught Thompson off guard. Before he could react, the monkey vaulted towards the door, disappearing into the dimly lit hallways of the nursing home. He stopped before further chaos ensued. "That gives me a delicious headache. This is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me before." Dr. Thompson shook his head, still, intent soberedness, discomfort, and it had to be stopped before further chaos ensued. He raced out into the hallway, following the monkey's faint laughs and shrieks echoing through the vacant corridors. He couldn't believe that just moments ago, Boo had managed to resemble his father so remarkably, not only in voice, but also appearance, causing an immense wave of fear and confusion. In his quest for answers, he had unintentionally opened the door to an even more confusing enigma. As Dr. Thompson gained ground on the monkey, he noticed staff members rushing from their stations towards him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. However, One glance at Dr. Thompson's distraught expression led them to quickly comprehend the urgency of this situation. Their attempts at asking for more information were met with vague answers and half-formed sentences as he continued his pursuit of Boo. Meanwhile, the monkey, seemingly unaware or unfazed by the ensuing commotion, led Thompson through an intricate labyrinth of corridors and wards. The hallways stretched on, seemingly multiplying, until the two of them were the only beings in the expansive space. It was then that Boo's laughs transformed into a series of harrowing, blood-curdling screams. Chapter 5. Days passed, and the spacious, high-ceilinged loft, once a refuge of restful solitude for Dr. Robert Thompson, transformed into a cage of his own making. The once pristine and neatly arranged apartment now echoed with Boo's distinct personality, leaving Dr. Thompson struggling to come to terms with his newfound reality. The grand bay windows whispered stories of the bustling city life, beckoning the real Dr. Thompson trapped within the monkey's body. The days crept by like snails, and the weeks trudged on with leaden feet as Dr. Thompson scrambled for answers. Boo, the monkey, in Robert's form, reveled in his newfound freedom and took every opportunity to tangle in human activities. He was enamored with the power his new role bestowed upon him. The transformation left the other primatologist in a constant loop of despair and self-doubt. Every day, he'd scrutinize their reflections side by side, anxiously searching for discrepancies in his once familiar facial features, the thinning hairline, the laughter lines creeping into the corners of his eyes, and the slight gap between his front teeth. He hoped to stumble upon one shred of proof that this agonizing ordeal would soon fade away. Alas, every reflection mockingly mirrored the reality he was trying to avoid. Boo had well and truly claimed Dr. Robert Thompson's identity. It was a chilling realization that sent a cold blanket of fear enveloping him. With no explanation, no clue as to how or why this happened, his entire world seemed to collapse around him. In an attempt to come to terms with this shocking turn of events, Thompson's days were filled with endless hours of research, trying to uncover any potential causes or reasons behind Boo's unprecedented ability to adopt his identity. One evening, Thompson found himself in his apartment, surrounded by piles of books, papers, and research notes, his mind consumed with questions. He pondered over each pen stroke, each argument, and the myriad theories about Boo's incredible transformation. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered room, while the city outside danced to its own rhythm. Out of the blue, a light knock echoed through the quiet apartment. With a groan, Thompson left his research den and few steps toward the door, his worn expressions betraying his wariness. He glanced through the spy hole, sighing in relief upon recognizing the unexpected visitor as his colleague and longtime friend, Dr. Anderson. Dr. Thompson turned the key, opening the door only slightly, and asked with genuine surprise, "Margaret, what are you doing here?" She replied matter-of-factly, "I wanted to check on you. I was worried since I hadn't heard from you in a while, but I see that my concerns were warranted. You look beyond exhausted. It's clear you haven't slept well in days." Dr. Anderson moved inside, taking a seat on the worn leather couch. The dim light cast elongated shadows across Dr. Thompson's face, highlighting the deep lines of worry that etched his features. "You're telling me I haven't slept much in weeks. I'm torn to pieces, struggling to make sense of what happened with Boo." His voice was husky, a testament to his sleepless nights. Dr. Anderson leaned in, her gaze compassionate. "You know you can trust me with anything, Bob. Tell me, what exactly happened?" she asked gently. Dr. Thompson hesitated before finally relaying the full story from start to finish, his voice trembling with emotion as he admitted the unfathomable transformation Boo had undergone. The words seemed to tumble out of him as if a floodgate had been opened, and once the story was out, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Dr. Anderson listened carefully, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. It's absolutely unbelievable. I've never heard of anything like this before. "Neither have I," Thompson replied, the weight of his words slowly sinking in. "I've spent countless hours researching this, but I can't find any explanation for it." "What about the facility where you got Boo from? Have you reached out to them for more information?" I have, but they won't help me. They claim they've never seen anything like this before." Anderson nodded solemnly. "Yes, that does sound like a dead end. What about contacting other primatologists or animal behaviorists? Maybe they could offer you some insight." Thompson sighed, leaning back against the soft leather of his couch. "I've tried, Margaret, but most of them think I'm exaggerating or completely insane." The corner of Anderson's mouth turned up in a sympathetic smile. "Oh, well, I can understand why they might think that. This is quite an extraordinary situation. But," she hesitated, glancing at her friend, "I have to ask, do you really believe that Boo has taken on your identity? Or is this just an elaborate experiment of yours?" Dr. Thompson felt his patience thin, and his eyes narrowed momentarily. "As I keep telling everyone, Margaret, I'm not making this up. You know me well enough to understand that I'm a man of facts and concrete, undeniable evidence. This isn't a flight of fancy or an experiment." Though anxious, he attempted to keep his tone calm and measured. "Every time I attempt to reveal the truth, those around me doubt or dismiss my words. I cannot force them to see with their eyes or comprehend with their thoughts. I can only show them the reality of the situation and hope for understanding." Your sincerity is unwavering here, but there must be something specific that explains such a change in Boo's abilities or behavior. Have you noticed any recent changes in his surroundings, routine, or exposure within the research facility? Margaret's questions tugged at Thompson's mind like a lifebuoy in a tempestuous sea. He reflected deeply in silence, recalling and cataloging Boo's life events before arriving at his apartment. "There's only one thing that comes to mind," Thompson finally said. "The week preceding Boo's arrival at my apartment, there was an incident with a rare electrical storm at the research facility. He managed to escape from his enclosure during the chaos. Perhaps something happened that night, some strange energy, a sudden flash, or unexpected environmental factor," recalled Thompson, finally tapping into the elusive clue that had been buried under layers of confusion. Dr. Anderson's gaze sharpened. "Intriguing. Describe the storm and how long it lasted." "The storm hit for nearly 3 hours, with strikes punctuating the sky at regular intervals. The air grew heavy with humidity, only to be interrupted by cold winds ushering in the rain. Boo, among the other lab animals, had been exposed to the storm. Yet, at the time, it didn't seem essential to consider the possibility of a connection, plagued as he was by myriad responsibilities and logistical concerns during cleanup. Dr. Anderson nodded slowly, her brow furrowed. "I see where you're going with this." Chapter 6. The pristine white walls of Dr. Thompson's laboratory seemed to gleam menacingly under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The air buzzed with anticipation and unease, as Dr. Anderson and her hand-picked team prepared for a mission they knew could be life-altering. "Ready, everyone?" Dr. Anderson's voice was firm, though her eyes betrayed an underlying anxiety. They each in unison nodded with determination, clutching sedative darts closely to their chests. Dr. Anderson stared at the locked steel cage housing Boo and a now comatose Dr. Thompson. "We must save him before it's too late." The team knew their task would be an uphill battle, to separate Boo from Dr. Thompson's body and restore the latter back to his original consciousness without harming either one. Under the sterile laboratory, a quiet tension built as they formulated a cautious yet decisive plan. Dr. Anderson approached Boo's containment, her fingers poised over the lock as if it would reveal its secrets. The air began to thicken, the tension in the room palpable as she glanced at her team in turn. "This shouldn't take long," a young man named Jason whispered confidently. "He's just a monkey, albeit a strangely intelligent one, but he should be easy enough to subdue." Behind his expression, however, Thompson caught a glimpse of doubt lingering in his eyes. Anderson seemed to sense this hesitation too, and gently rested her hand on Jason's shoulder. "We're all feeling a little on edge. But remember, we've prepared for this. Boo is a unique case, yes, but the essence of our work remains unchanged. We must approach this with the same precision and caution we would with any experimental subject." Jason nodded firmly, taking in her words of support. The team turned their attention back to the steel cage as Dr. Anderson slowly eased the door open, creating a gap just wide enough for them to fire their sedative darts. Breath held, eyes focused, they waited for Boo to appear. As if sensing their presence, Boo's mischievous eyes peered through the crack, and in a split second, he darted away, barely avoiding the first dart. Their hearts pounded in time with swift movements of the agile monkey, dodging and weaving through the cramped confines of the laboratory with remarkable grace. "Be quick, but careful," Dr. Anderson called out, stepping lightly towards the cage. "Boo, we don't want to hurt you, but this has to stop. Come peacefully so we can figure things out, okay?" Bet like a bolt of lightning, Boo evaded her gentle voice, evoking the faintest glimmer of disbelief in Dr. Anderson's usually impenetrable expression. With impressive agility, Boo climbed up onto a lab table and bounded across the room to escape through the slightly opened window. Gasps rang around the lab as Boo disappeared from view, vanished from their grasp. The sense of urgency coursed through the team, and they raced after the monkey without a second thought. Outside, they found their cityscape rearranged in an unfamiliar dance of shadows and light. The darkness hid Boo's black and white fur, causing the team to scatter and search every nook and cranny. Meanwhile, Dr. Thompson remained in the lab, trapped within Boo's body, unable to help. He felt utterly helpless as he watched his colleagues rush out in pursuit of the renegade monkey. As the hours ticked by, the chances of finding Boo in time grew dimmer. They needed to act quickly before the sedatives wore off. Although fear and frustration gnawed at him, Thompson's mind raced as he tried to figure out what could have triggered such a transformation. He was keenly aware that every answer lay in the hands of his colleagues, in recovering Boo and finding out more about this mysterious electrical storm. The team regrouped in the lab, faces tight with frustration and resolve. They knew it was time to plan their next move. "We've lost precious time," Dr. Anderson sighed, rubbing her temples. "We need to locate Boo before the sedative wears off and he returns to Thompson's body." "Do you really think that's possible?" asked Dr. Benjamin, a new addition to the team. "It's been hours since we lost sight of him." Dr. Anderson looked him in the eye, her gaze steady and resolute. "Yes, it's not just possible, Dr. Benjamin. It's necessary. If we don't, Dr. Thompson might never be able to return to his real body." Jason, a young yet talented team member, spoke up. "Dr. Anderson, what if I scour the city's abandoned buildings and warehouses? It's likely he retreated to a place that mimics his natural habitat and is hidden from humans." Dr. Anderson nodded in agreement. "That's a great idea, Jason. But for now, everyone should get some rest. We'll reconvene and reassess our plan in the morning." The gathering dispersed, and soon the lab was shrouded in an eerie silence. Caught between the throes of anticipation and exhaustion, Dr. Thompson could hardly close his eyes. The idea of Boo roaming the city's shadows made him dizzy with fear. A few restless hours later, the first light of dawn outlined the lab's windows. Dr. Thompson lay awake, his mind racing, the weight of the quandary pressing on his shoulders as he anticipated the waiting developments with trepidation. He knew the decisions made today would alter the course of everything he knew and understood. Precise footsteps echoed down the hallway, and with a sigh, Dr. Thompson sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. He glanced at the now unconscious Boo, resting calmly in the cage, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil unfolding around him. A few moments later, Dr. Anderson appeared, her expression somber. After exchanging a few encouraging words with her team, she took a seat next to Thompson. "We've combed the city all night long, but there's no sign of Boo," she said gently. "We can't wait for him to show up by himself. We need to find him now and reverse what he's done to you before it's too late." A stony determination etched across her face. She turned to address the others. "This is what we're going to do. We have a trace amount of the sedative left on hand from before. It's risky, but we need to lure Boo into the lab. We need to use the sedative to put him to sleep once and for all, then conduct further research on him while his consciousness remains dormant." Jason nodded. "I'll bring in some bananas as bait and scatter them throughout the room just outside the door. With any luck, Boo will come back for them, and we'll be ready. We'll need to be exceptionally careful not to tranquilize you in the crossfire." Dr. Anderson informed Thompson, hoping that the plan would work without endangering anyone in the process. The air filled with a thick silence as the team gathered their thoughts. No one dared to interrupt. They knew how crucial this moment could be in saving their friend and respected colleague. As Dr. Anderson prepared to execute the plan, there was a commotion outside the lab. Chapter 7. Dr. Thompson's apartment, nestled in the heart of the city, overlooked the bustling metropolis with a breathtaking panoramic spectacle. The vast bay windows spanned the room's length, offering a glimpse into the vast world outside, while the cozy living space harbored a multitude of trinkets, painstakingly collected over the years. The team meticulously prepared the lab, orchestrating a plan that would hopefully bring Boo to his dormant state, allowing Dr. Thompson to be expunged from this curious predicament. With bananas as alluring bait, they scattered them across the cold, sterile floor of the lab. Next, they carefully doused a single banana with the remnants of the sedative and placed it in Dr. Thompson's once familiar hands, now cold, pale, and alien. The sounds of the city, which had once soothed his soul, now grated on his nerves like a discordant symphony. He needed answers, and the only way he sought to get them was to carry on with his research, hoping that somewhere along the way he'd find a solution, keeping the council of experts safe for the American people, and a God could be listening. Decision to Anne May. Was glimmered a start living door, he said, thinking the clouds, that clear sky. Think the two things out louder. While Dr. Thompson's colleagues were trying to lure Boo into the lab, he sat in his desk in his pristine but now foreign apartment, staring intently at a lab report. The clutter of books and notes around him, coupled with the darkness of the night that enveloped the city in its grasp, made the apartment feel like a labyrinth. With weary hands, Thompson sifted through the mounds of paperwork, searching for anything that could help him unravel this peculiar mystery. The shadows cast by the flickering city lights seemed to dance to an old, familiar tune, drawing Thompson deep into a vortex of memories, long forgotten. Before he knew it, the early morning sun had begun to peek through the bay windows, signaling the beginning of a new day. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, were glued to a particular page in one of his many research records, where something had caught his attention. With widening eyes, he scrutinized the patterns in Boo's behavior while at the research facility, carefully analyzing weeks of documented daily logs. As though guided by a keen intuition, Dr. Thompson jotted down various notes and observations about Boo's actions and sudden disinterest in his regular routine. The doorbell of his apartment echoed through the space just as he gathered a pile of data pertinent to Boo's peculiar behavior. With a swift movement, he navigated around stacks of research before eventually arriving at the door and peering through the peephole. A familiar face emerged, Dr. Margaret Anderson, his longtime colleague and friend. Thompson sighed in relief and hastily walked towards the door, a knot in his stomach unraveling ever so slightly. "Margaret, what brings you here?" His voice quavered slightly, casting a shadow over his usual composure, immediately alerting Anderson of the stress that Thompson was under. "I've been seeking you out for days, Robert," Dr. Anderson said with a hint of concern, the creases around her eyes deepening with worry. Upon closer inspection, Thompson realized that she was not alone. Dr. Benjamin, another colleague, waited patiently outside the apartment building's entrance. I realized that we haven't caught up in quite some time, and I wanted to check in on you. But I also have someone here eager to meet with you. Dr. Benjamin here is a new researcher at the lab, and he specializes in electrical storm anomalies, she explained as Dr. Benjamin stepped forward with an outstretched hand. I've heard a lot about the important work you've done, Dr. Thompson. I'm excited to see how we can collaborate and expand upon your research. Dr. Thompson shook his hand with a polite nod, noticing how the younger researcher seemed to be assessing him carefully, making mental notes. Returning his gaze to Dr. Anderson, he said, "Please, come in. I was just gathering some data on Boo's behavior. It appears there have been some significant changes in his actions and interests after a peculiar incident. Have either of you heard about a 3-hour-long electrical storm that happened around a week before Boo escaped the lab?" Dr. Thompson queried as the three researchers entered the loft. A spark of curiosity seemed to ignite within Dr. Benjamin as he began to share his extensive knowledge on the topic. Indeed, such phenomena are rare but utterly fascinating. They can trigger unusual and unpredictable changes in biological systems. Dr. Thompson, I'm intrigued to know how this factors into Boo's behavior. Care to elaborate? Dr. Benjamin requested, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, ushering them toward the living area by the windows. The reports I've gathered thus far indicate an unusual shift in Boo's interests and interaction patterns during the week after that storm. This leads me to believe that some latent impact of the electrical disturbance on his neurological function may have occurred. However, I haven't yet concluded what could have triggered this extreme transformation. Dr. Thompson's explanations piqued Dr. Benjamin's interest. Perhaps some recount of the storm's specifics might shed more light on the issue. As Thompson told them about the storm, Anderson's eyes widened at the description of its severity. She concurred. We've studied similar unusual events that cause aberrations in primate behavior, which could corroborate how an electrical storm of such magnitude might have impacted Boo. Unfortunately, cases like these are rare, and we still need a more extensive data set to draw precise conclusions. With a shared understanding of the significance, the researchers gathered at the living space by the windows, while Thompson sifted through a pile of reports, laying out the observations before them. Benjamin pointed at particular recordings that highlighted Boo's behavioral shift. It seems that Boo went from an observant, docile creature to one exhibiting signs of panic and aggression after the storm. Thompson sighed, rubbing his forehead. That's just it. The shift was gradual, but still sudden enough to observe. There were subtle changes in the way he interacted with me, even in the days leading up to the storm. I dismissed it as stress or anxiety, but now, I suppose I misinterpreted the signs. Anderson leaned forward, intensely listening to her colleague's thought process. That's a crucial observation, Robert. A gradual change might suggest a heightened sensitivity to the environmental factors around him. Any notable fluctuation must have triggered a reaction. The storm may just be what tipped the scales. As Thompson and Anderson conversed, Benjamin couldn't help but contribute with his expertise. It's possible that Boo was so deeply affected by the storm's energy, its force could have left an imprint on his neurological conditioning. Since you mention he had been mimicking your movements and actions for years, it Makes sense that the intense electrical charge may have activated his dormant abilities, almost as if he absorbed some of your own consciousness. Dr. Thompson's eyes widened with astonishment, then narrowed in contemplation. He'd heard of such things before, but considered such stories as mere flights of fancy among their field of research. You think he's taken on my identity? Because of that fateful night? Dr. Anderson let out a measured breath, one that carried years of wisdom and study. It's a sound theory, Benjamin, but as you mentioned earlier, cases like Boo's are far and few between. It's seldom seen, except in stories and legend. But the evidence piles up and points in an intriguing direction. A solemn nod of affirmation traveled between the researchers. As the early morning sunlight spilled into the apartment, Thompson paced back and forth, the worn wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath his every step. Desperation gripped him, wrestling with fear. And if he's taken on your identity, he'll recognize it as his home, just as much as you used to. Dr. Anderson stated calmly, though Thompson could see a hint of unease lurking in the corners of her eyes. Dr. Thompson nodded slowly, absently tracing circles on the worn tablecloth. Yes, you're right. But doing that, we risk another confrontation like the one we experienced. And if it turns hostile, we may lose him. We can't let him run away again. Dr. Benjamin responded urgently. Can't happen, Dr. Thompson. Boo might slip into obscurity again, or worse, be captured and exploited for nefarious purposes. We need to capture him before things escalate beyond our control. The room fell silent as the researchers contemplated the best approach. Thompson took a deep breath and stopped pacing, a renewed sense of determination crossing his features. We'll do it at first light tomorrow. I'll entice him with something familiar and alluring. Food. Boo loves bananas, and the sheer sight of them might rouse him from his dormant state. We must devise a plan that minimizes the potential for chaos when he encounters us. All right, we'll make a trap. Dr. Anderson, you and Dr. Benjamin stay at my apartment tonight to keep an eye on the surveillance footage from the facility. I'll prepare the bait and work on a capturing technique. Dr. Thompson agreed, finally finding his resolve to take action. Dr. Thompson and his team devised a meticulous plan to finally confront Boo. They set up a hidden camera and sedative-laced bananas in the lab, hoping to lure Boo back. After a tense night of waiting, Boo entered the lab, drawn by the familiar sights and smells. He cautiously approached the bananas, but hesitated, sensing the trap. However, as hunger overtook him, Boo took a bite, and moments later, he was sedated. With Boo unconscious, the team began the delicate procedure to reverse the effects of his transformation. They hypothesized that another electrical surge might restore Dr. Thompson's consciousness. As they activated the equipment, a bolt of energy crackled through the room, illuminating Boo's limp form. After a few tense minutes, Boo's eyes flickered open, revealing a familiar, human intelligence within. Dr. Thompson was back, his consciousness restored. As he adjusted to his human body, he reflected on the strange and unsettling ordeal, vowing to approach his research with greater caution. From that day on, Dr. Thompson lived with a new understanding of consciousness and identity, forever haunted by the memories of what it felt like to lose himself to the mimicry of his once beloved pet. Boo, though returned to his natural behavior, remained a reminder of the mysteries and dangers that lurk in the uncharted depths of the mind. If you like this story, and for more dark stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. See ya!